The day my marriage fell apart didn't begin with shouting, slammed doors, or dramatic accusations. It began with a smile that never reached my wife's eyes. After spending a week on a luxury girls' trip with her wealthy friends, she walked through our front door carrying designer shopping bags, expensive perfume, and a silence that felt heavier than any suitcase. I hugged her, relieved she was home, but she barely hugged me back. I convinced myself she was simply exhausted. After 12 years of marriage, I believed trust meant giving the person you loved the benefit of the doubt. For the next few weeks, something about her felt different. She spent more time staring at her phone than talking to me. She drifted through our home like a stranger who had forgotten why she was there. Every time I asked if something was wrong, she forced a smile and told me she was just tired. I wanted to believe her because the alternative was too painful to imagine. Then one evening, she asked me to sit down. Her hands trembled as she held a small white envelope. When she looked up, tears filled her eyes. "Mara, I'm pregnant," she whispered. For a moment, my heart stopped. We had spent years praying for that miracle. Countless doctor's appointments, sleepless nights, and silent disappointments had brought us to this moment. I wrapped my arms around her, overwhelmed with joy. Then a simple thought crossed my mind. I quietly counted the weeks since she had returned from her trip. The dates didn't make sense. Trying to hide my growing confusion, I gently asked, "When do the doctors think the baby was conceived?" And the color drained from her face. Her breathing became uneven, and she looked at me with a fear I had never seen before. In that instant, I realized she wasn't afraid of becoming a mother. She was terrified of answering one simple question. "Hi everyone, I have only 24 subscribers so far. My next goal is to reach 50 subscribers. If you enjoy my stories, please subscribe to my channel. Your one subscription means a lot to me. Thank you." Before that terrible evening, I believed my wife and I had built the kind of marriage that could survive almost anything. We had been together for 12 years. And although we never had the luxury of expensive vacations or grand houses, we had something I thought was far more valuable. We had loyalty. We celebrated small victories, comforted each other through disappointments, and dreamed about the family we hoped to have one day. Every extra shift I worked and every sacrifice we made felt worthwhile because I believed we were building a future together. Money was always tight. I worked long hours managing a local warehouse while she held an office job that helped us pay the bills. We rarely complained because we shared the same goal. We wanted a home filled with love and, if we were fortunate enough, children. Year after year, we visited doctors, followed treatments, and encouraged each other through heartbreaking setbacks. Every negative pregnancy test hurt us both, yet we promised never to let disappointment divide us. Things slowly began to change after she reconnected with her childhood best friend, Vanessa. Unlike us, Vanessa lived a life of effortless luxury. Her husband owned several successful businesses, and their social circles seemed to exist in a completely different world. They traveled whenever they pleased, wore designer clothes without checking price tags, and hosted glamorous parties where everyone seemed determined to impress one another. At first, I was happy my wife had someone who made her smile again. She returned from lunches laughing about stories I couldn't relate to, and I enjoyed seeing her happier. But little by little, those lunches became weekend getaways. Weekend getaways became exclusive parties. Soon she was spending more time with people who measured success by wealth instead of character. I noticed expensive handbags appearing in our bedroom. When I asked where they came from, she casually said Vanessa had surprised her with another gift. She started wearing jewelry I knew we could never afford. She insisted it meant nothing and reminded me that friends often spoiled each other. I chose to believe her because questioning her felt like questioning the foundation of our marriage. Then came the late-night messages. Whenever her phone buzzed, she would glance at the screen and quickly lock it before I could accidentally see the sender's name. If I entered the room unexpectedly, conversations ended just a little too quickly. She smiled less at me and more at her phone. Looking back, every warning sign was quietly standing in front of me. The gifts, the secrecy, the growing emotional distance, and the constant excuses all pointed toward something I refused to see. I ignored every warning because I believed trust meant never questioning the person you loved. That belief would soon become the greatest mistake of my life. After that conversation about the pregnancy, nothing inside me felt stable anymore. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation for her fear, but every passing day made that hope harder to hold on to. Instead of celebrating the pregnancy together, my wife became even more distant. She carried her phone everywhere, even into the bathroom. If it rang while I was nearby, she would silence it before I could hear who was calling. The woman who once shared every thought with me now guarded ordinary conversations, as though they were dangerous secrets. She also began avoiding any real closeness between us. Every attempt to comfort her was met with an excuse. She blamed exhaustion, morning sickness, stress, or work. I understood that pregnancy could be overwhelming, so I never pressured her. Still, I couldn't ignore how carefully she avoided looking into my eyes. It was as though guilt had built an invisible wall between us. The unexplained appointments started soon afterward. She would tell me she had another prenatal checkup, yet she never invited me to come along. Whenever I offered to drive her, she insisted one of her friends had already volunteered. That alone wasn't proof of anything, but the pattern slowly chipped away at the trust I had spent 12 years building. One Saturday morning, she left early to meet Vanessa, saying they were having breakfast together. While putting away the clothes she had never unpacked from the girls' trip, I noticed something wedged inside a side pocket of her suitcase. It was a receipt from an exclusive beachfront hotel. The date matched one of the nights. She had told me they were staying at a private rental house. I stared at the paper for several minutes. It could have been an innocent mistake. Someone else could have booked a room. I wanted every possible explanation except the one my heart was beginning to fear. Instead of confronting her, I folded the receipt and returned it exactly where I had found it. If she was hiding something, I didn't want her to know I had started asking questions. A few days later, I came home earlier than expected. As I stepped inside, I heard her speaking softly in the kitchen. She hadn't noticed me yet. "I know," she whispered. "But if he asks for a DNA test, everything falls apart." The room went silent. A second later, she turned, saw me standing there, and quickly ended the call. She forced an uneasy smile and claimed she had been talking to Vanessa about someone else's family problems. I nodded without arguing. For the first time in my life, I realized that trust without truth becomes blindness. The hotel receipt wasn't the worst thing I had found. The real nightmare was only beginning to reveal itself. The truth came out 3 days after I overheard that phone call. I didn't raise my voice or accuse her of anything. I simply asked if we could sit down after dinner because I needed honest answers. She barely touched her food. Her hands shook as she stared at the table, avoiding my eyes. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we could have had. I placed the hotel receipt on the table without saying a word. She looked at it, closed her eyes, and let out a long breath. For a moment, I thought she might deny everything. Instead, tears rolled down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Those 3 words should have sounded like the beginning of healing. Instead, they marked the end of the life I thought we had built together. With a trembling voice, she admitted that during the girls' trip, everyone had been drinking late into the night. What began as a celebration turned into poor decisions, blurred judgment, and a betrayal she claimed she never imagined would happen. The man involved wasn't a stranger. He was the husband of her wealthy best friend. I sat perfectly still. Every memory from the past few weeks suddenly made sense. The fear, the secret phone calls, the strange appointments, the conversation about a DNA test. Then she looked at me with desperate eyes. "The baby isn't yours." Those words echoed through my mind until I could barely hear anything else. I asked the only question that mattered. "Does his wife know?" She nodded slowly. "She knows." I couldn't understand why everyone had remained silent. A few days later, I found out. Vanessa invited us to her house, saying we needed to talk like adults. I agreed because I still hoped there was some explanation that would restore at least a fragment of dignity. Instead, I walked into a room where several of her closest friends were already waiting. There were no apologies. There was no shame. Vanessa calmly said that everyone had made mistakes and that destroying multiple families would only make things worse. Another woman suggested that I should simply raise the baby as my own because, in her words, good men are hard to find. Someone quietly laughed and called me too ordinary to understand how people in their social circle handled complicated situations. My wife didn't laugh, but she didn't defend me either. Then she softly asked if we could pretend nothing had happened and give the child a stable home. At that moment, I realized they weren't asking for forgiveness. They were asking me to carry the consequences of choices I had never made. I stood up without shouting or insulting anyone. I thanked them for finally telling me the truth and walked out the front door. Behind me, they mistook my silence for surrender. They believed I would quietly raise another man's child and protect the reputation of everyone who had deceived me. They had no idea I had already begun, preparing for the day the truth would speak louder than any of them ever could. The morning after I walked out of Vanessa's house, I made myself a promise. I would not allow anger to make decisions that would shape the rest of my life. I had already lost my marriage. I refused to lose my dignity as well. Instead of arguing with my wife or exposing her to friends and relatives, I quietly contacted an experienced family lawyer. During our first meeting, I told him everything from the girl's trip to her admission that the baby was not mine. He listened carefully before giving me simple advice. From this moment forward, he said, don't chase confessions, preserve facts. Those words changed my approach completely. I began saving every text message, email, and voice message connected to the affair. Whenever my wife admitted something in conversation, I wrote down the date, time, and details immediately afterward. My lawyer explained that clear records often mattered more than emotional accusations. At the same time, I gathered every financial document connected to our marriage. Bank statements, joint accounts, credit card records, insurance policies, and property paperwork were copied and stored safely. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was protecting myself from surprises that often appeared during difficult divorces. My lawyer also recommended hiring a licensed private investigator. Within weeks, he uncovered information I could never have found alone. Hotel records confirmed that my wife and Vanessa's husband had checked into the same luxury resort during the trip. Security photographs placed them together. Long after the rest of the group had returned to their rooms, witness statements from hotel employees described them leaving together early the following morning. The investigator also discovered messages showing that several members of their social circle already knew what had happened. Instead of encouraging honesty, they had discussed keeping the affair secret until after the baby was born. Reading those conversations hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. Meanwhile, my wife watched me move quietly through each day. Because I never raised my voice or demanded another explanation, she assumed I had accepted the situation. She mistook my silence for defeat. She couldn't see the folders growing inside my lawyer's office or the evidence being carefully organized, piece by piece. Every document, every message, every receipt, and every witness statement brought the truth into sharper focus. They believed they still controlled the story because they controlled the lies. They never realized that every lie they told was slowly building a case that would eventually follow them into a courtroom where only the truth would matter. The day of the divorce hearing arrived with a strange sense of calm. Months earlier, I would have walked into that courthouse carrying anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Instead, I carried a neatly organized folder prepared by my lawyer. I had learned that emotions fade, but facts remain. Whatever happened that day would be decided by evidence, not by the loudest voice in the room. My wife sat across from me without speaking. The confidence I had seen at Vanessa's house was gone. Her wealthy friends were present as witnesses, but they avoided looking in my direction. For the first time since everything began, they seemed to understand that the story they had carefully protected no longer belonged to them. The proceedings started with routine matters before my lawyer calmly presented the timeline we had spent months documenting. Hotel records confirmed where my wife had stayed during the trip. Financial records showed expenses that contradicted the version of events she had originally given me. Copies of text messages demonstrated that several people had discussed hiding the affair. Rather than encouraging honesty, one by one, the facts replaced every excuse. Then came the DNA results. The court formally acknowledged that I was not the biological father of the unborn child. Although I had already known the truth, hearing those words spoken aloud still hurt. It marked the end of a dream my wife and I had shared for years. Yet it also freed me from a burden that never belonged to me. As questioning continued, more uncomfortable truths emerged. My lawyer presented evidence showing that money had been moved between accounts without my knowledge during the final months of our marriage. There was no dramatic accusation, only documents, signatures, and dates. Each record quietly revealed another piece of deception. Vanessa and the others were called to testify. Their earlier confidence quickly disappeared under careful questioning. They admitted they knew about the affair long before I did. They acknowledged encouraging my wife to remain silent until after the child was born, believing the truth could simply be buried beneath time and convenience. The judge listened patiently before reminding everyone that honesty is not optional in matters that affect another person's life and legal rights. Their explanations were rejected not because they had made mistakes, but because they had deliberately chosen deception over accountability. When the final judgment was delivered, the marriage officially ended. The court resolved our financial matters according to the evidence presented, ensuring a fair division based on the law rather than manipulation. No one applauded. There were no dramatic celebrations. Justice rarely arrives with applause. It often arrives quietly, leaving people alone with the consequences of their own decisions. As I gathered my documents, I noticed the same people who had once laughed at me walking toward the courthouse exit without saying a word. Their expensive clothes and confident smiles could not hide the weight they now carried. I stepped outside and took my first deep breath in months. I believed the hardest chapter of my life had finally closed. But waiting near the courthouse entrance was someone I never expected to see, carrying information that would change the way I understood the entire story. Outside the courthouse, the person waiting for me was the private investigator who had helped uncover the truth. He handed me a final envelope containing documents that were no longer legally necessary but answered one question that had quietly lingered in my mind. The affair had not been a single reckless mistake. It had begun before the girls' trip, and several people had spent months helping to hide it. I looked at the papers for a moment, then closed the envelope without reading another page. For the first time since everything began, I realized I didn't need any more answers. The truth I already had was enough to set me free. Months passed, and life slowly found a new rhythm. The silence inside my home no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. I returned to simple routines that I had neglected for years. I spent time with family, members who had quietly supported me without asking for details. I reconnected with old friends, focused on my work, and discovered that healing rarely happens all at once. It grows quietly through ordinary days when you finally stop carrying someone else's choices on your shoulders. Looking back, I no longer measured my life by the marriage I had lost. Instead, I measured it by the dignity I had managed to protect. Betrayal had taken away my trust, but it had also revealed the people who truly belonged in my life. Some relationships survive hardship because they are built on honesty. Others collapse because they were held together only by convenient lies. I never celebrated my ex-wife's downfall. I didn't need revenge to feel whole again. The consequences of her decisions belonged to her, just as the responsibility for rebuilding my future belonged to me. That understanding gave me a peace that anger never could. Today, when people ask how I survived the darkest chapter of my life, I give them the same answer. Protect your character more carefully than your pride. Pride demands immediate revenge. Character chooses patience, truth, and self-respect. In the end, I stopped seeing myself as the man who had been deceived. I became the man who refused to surrender his dignity when deception surrounded him. And I learned one lesson that will stay with me forever. Karma doesn't always arrive with anger. Sometimes it simply removes the people who never deserved to walk beside you, leaving you free to become the person they never believed you could be.